As we're about to formally begin, I did want to take a moment to offer a land acknowledgement as a time of reflection to recognize and offer respect to Indigenous lands, treaties, and peoples. So while today we meet virtually, the University of Toronto operates on the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have this opportunity to work on this land. I'm also very pleased to introduce today's presenters, Mark Shelvock, and where is Jodi? Jodi Gorham. Here we go. Our lovely presenters. Thank you both for joining us today. Jodi is a registered social worker, child and youth counselor, circle facilitator, Reiki master, and the founder and managing director of JAG Village. She's a wife and mother of 2 children, Davis, who she holds in her arms, and Georgia, who she now holds in her heart. And with over 20 years of professional experience in mental health, along with her personal experiences with trauma and grief, Jodi is passionate about honoring and supporting people of all ages. Mark is a registered psychotherapist and a certified thanatologist, and he brings internationally recognized clinical expertise in attachment theory, developmental psychology, psychodynamics, and thanatology. Mark also maintains a clinical private practice that specializes in providing grief counseling and trauma-responsive psychotherapy. So welcome again, Jodi and Mark. Thanks so much for being here. And now I will hand things over to the both of you.
Thank you, Tioni. I did see some of those answers to the poll. I'm so interested in what other means for people. But I'm so excited that all of you have joined us. Last 87 participants. That definitely warms my heart that we're able to reach 87 people who are learning to be comfortable in the uncomfortable. And so we're so excited to have you all here. So to continue sort of setting up the space a little bit, Mark and I wanted to invite you to consider making this space a brave space. So we can probably move to the next slide. As we talk about grief and trauma and how they sort of intersect and how we can support it. Oh, my brain.
And I'll just hop in here.
Yeah.
It's such a great honor and privilege to be here. And we're faculty members in the grief education program. And this is really just a one-of-a-kind program where we're taking people from all walks of life, from all disciplines, and actually taking people out of their silos and bringing them together. We're doing that because grief belongs in the community. Grief is a multidimensional experience. It has a psychological, a physical, a social, emotional, social, cultural, societal, existential. Like it's so multidimensional, and people are working with grief and trauma in a variety of settings. And so this is why we have this program for adults for continuing in professional education. And Tioni will talk a little bit more at the end of the presentation for folks who haven't heard about the program and are maybe interested. I also just saw we have a lot of our alumni here today as well and current learners. So we're so glad you're here with us learning live. As Jodi says, that really does warm our hearts. So here's a couple pictures of us for you to enjoy. And we also have our colleague there on the left side of the screen, Dr. Karima Joy, who initiated the whole grief education program. So I'm sure Karima is here with us in spirit, today. So next slide, please. I'll let you take it away, Jodi, on the next
I
slide.
know I was moving too fast. I was moving too fast, and I definitely wanted to echo everything Mark said. Our program at OAZ, it's a privilege and an honor to be a part of it because it's very unique in everything Mark's already shared. That we have the privilege and honor of working with so many different disciplines, and we honor that we bring knowledge and wisdom into the space, but we know that so do all the learners, and those spaces wouldn't be as rich without the vulnerability of all those people we've had the opportunity to facilitate and learn with. So now jumping to where I was going before the other part is we're encouraging sort of a brave space today. And Liza, I noticed you already commented back when I was being curious about what other meant. And so I absolutely appreciate that that vulnerability is starting. So when we're in this presentation, we're looking at sort of paralleling the way in which grief support is one of the key markers of grief support is being present and being curious and learning to be comfortable in the uncomfortable and recognizing that everybody in this space brings wisdom, whether that's knowledge learned through school, through mentors, education, your vocational experiences, or whether they're through lived experiences. All of them are welcome and all of them are valued. We do ask that self-reflection be required because when we're doing grief work, we're also looking inwards about what we're bringing into this space and having an awareness of how that might be impacting the relationship, the grief experience itself. And we also are inviting the idea of compassionately unlearning. So much has been taught to us that maybe has not been explicitly taught. Sometimes has been very explicitly taught. We don't talk about things that make people feel uncomfortable in public places. And sometimes we just kind of have learned that there's certain things we don't do or say. And we're asking that you be open to unlearning some of these things as we invite you to have sort of a paradigm shift in the way that grief lives and breathes in our westernized society. Anything, Mark, you want to add to that?
That's beautifully said. I would just add that I think being willing to bring a critically reflective eye to grief and loss in any capacity is one of the most courageous and heroic things any person can do. So, regardless of why you're here, we're so glad you are here, that you're doing the work that you're doing. We appreciate you. We want to work and learn with you. Okay. And thank you for just participating in this conversation today and puncturing the collective unconsciousness around these very difficult and taboo topics.
Hence why Mark is a grief rock star. We love the term rock star, taking it out of some of those old sort of academic, even though academic, there's a role for academia, we also want to really blow this up like rock stars. And we invite you to be rock stars with us. And so in starting this, I want to sort of like, again, parallel the work that we're all doing, whether it be personal or professional or have an understanding, is a lots of times we're taught to be in our head and to think things. And with grief, there's a saying about you need to feel it to heal it. And so Mark and I wanted to invite you to sort of also move into your heart space, in and out of your head space and into your heart space as we provide both sort of environments here. So when you yourself think about grief, what comes up for you? What kind of things, if you sit still for a moment, come up in your body? And when you visualize grief, are there images that come with it? Are there colors? Because one thing we know in our westernized society of sort of a grief avoidant culture is sometimes our language doesn't always do grief justice. And we don't always have the words that can really express what people are feeling and living with. And so I invite you to sit with yourself as you learn what grief has felt like, maybe for you personally or professionally. And then we thought we'd invite, if anybody wants to share, you're welcome to share within the chat about what comes up for you. I've also, Mark and I have also come up with a few images that have been shared with us over time that have allowed um, people to maybe feel their grief very differently than speak their grief. Yeah, it's gray and a thick fog, an absence of color, heavy, achy, absolutely. Swirls of color. I love the contrast here. Tears and crying. Yeah, memory, not being able to remember. I'm not even going to catch all these. They're going up so fast now. Body aches, quietness, oppressive. Thank you for bringing that into the space. Water, waves. Yes, we have lots of water analogies. Dysregulation, melancholy. Sorry if I'm missing some of these. They're just coming up so fast. Disorientating, words from memory. Wow, these are really powerful. Outside looking in. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing. Thank you. Thank you for creating this brave space. Yeah, that what do I do next feeling. Absolutely. I almost feel like I didn't need pictures because you guys are painting such a a beautiful canvas here. Stigmatization. Yeah. So if it's okay with all of you, I'd still like to share a little of the photos we have because I also think they may be good tools and conversations that you may have with people to continue. Um, and and also I invite you to use lots of the lived experience and feelings that are coming up right now. These are all wonderful and real. So our first example that we have here around the knapsack um, is moving away from like that pathologizing way of thinking about grief as of grief being a problem. And I'm not going to say too much because Mark's going to dive deeper shortly. But the idea is something we learn to carry. So if I gave you a knapsack and asked full of these huge rocks and asked you to wear it for the rest of your life, today you might not be able to stand up. You might not be able to move much. However, with time, accepting support from others, allowing people to help lift you, being able to understand, working on things, building muscles, you're able to carry that bag of rocks. And that bag of rocks is always going to be there, but you've learned to carry it with you every day. And that sort of parallels grief is that it doesn't ever really go away. We learn to live and grow with it. The second one is one I just sort of picked out myself because I remember resonating very early on in my own grief. And I saw it in words, and this is kind of the picture of what I visualize about child loss is like my heart shattered, and every day a piece of that of my shattered heart pierces my soul. And that feels very real for me still 7 years into this. And this image is to sort of lead into what Mark's going to share and talk about is the idea that um, some of the history in grief is that we think that grief starts off really big and over time it starts to shrink and get smaller. And it goes along with the knapsack of actually grief is always as big as it felt day one. We've learned to sort of grow around it, and our life, we adapt, and the life around us changes, and we figure out what we need and what our environment needs. So hopefully those are good starts. I think we move on to Mark now.
Yeah, thank you for that rich imagery, Jodi. And thanks everyone for participating so actively. We really appreciate the collective sharing today. So let's just get started with grief support and what is grief in the simplest sense. So when we start talking about bereavement, what you need to know is that it's a two-part recipe. Okay, and it's a really shitty two-part recipe. This is an awful experience to go through. And yes, I am a therapist who swears. If you work with people around traumatic loss, you will also start swearing. This is one of those telltale signs you've worked in the industry for a while, okay, in the profession. So bereavement really just means, when you break down the etymology, to be deprived and separated of something, okay? And this something has to be, this is the second part, you have to subjectively value it. So loss really, in a nutshell, is whatever a person says it is. It's always determined in the eye of the beholder, okay? And two things has to happen. That bereavement process, we have to subjectively value this, and there has to be attachment. If there's not attachment, it's just water off your back. It's not a big deal, and that's fine, but that's not grief, okay? So what is this? Well, we subjectively value whatever this thing is, and we're being separated and deprived of it. And it is a very distressing experience to go through this. And whatever it is, well, you actually get to determine that, not consciously, but your attachment system does, which I'll talk about in just a second. So when we talk about loss, we're really talking about two domains of loss. We're talking about dying and death, and we're also talking about non-death related losses. And so non-death related losses might be tangible or intangible in nature. So a tangible loss might be the loss of a home, right? This is just a very objective, materialistic, thing that exists that we can experience deprivation from. Or something might be intangible, like a loss of identity, a loss of meaning, losing a sense of dignity, freedom, okay? Safety, trust. These are all very intangible things. And so we take a really inclusive approach to loss in our program, particularly because non-death related losses, change and transition and all of its manifestations typically occur on a more frequent basis in our Western industrial world, okay? But loss is loss. And so if loss is loss and bereavement is feeling separated and deprived of that subjectively valued thing, well, then grief is the natural response that comes next to that. So grief is a natural and instinctive response to loss. Grief is multidimensional, like I was saying earlier. It impacts the whole person. And from a psychobiological perspective, we know that people feel grief before they actually think about grief. So what do I mean? I mean that we are feeling and sensing beings who sometimes think, rather than thinking beings who sometimes feel and sense. So yes, there is a huge thought and cognitive aspect to grief that's very important. It's multidimensional. But it's just important people know, and why Jodi was asking you about, like, what does it feel? Can we capture this in non-literal language symbolically? Where do you feel that on your body? And that's because there is always a psychosomatic component to grief, and it's very important. And so what's so important to know about grief is that there's good and bad days, right? Like Jodi said, that grief stays with you. Closure, wow, what a nice idea, but it's bullshit, right? And if only there was a step-by-step staged linear process in which we could go with it. Turns out it's a nice idea, but it's made up. It's not an accurate depiction of people's experiences of suffering. If you're interested in learning more about that, we talk about that extensively in our program. I also just want to say continuing a relationship with what was lost, whether it was a relationship, the person who died, an experience, whatever it was, it's often therapeutic to actually connect to it. And that really goes against a lot of social and cultural norms. Okay, next slide, please. So I mentioned the attachment system. Well, it turns out that, if you've ever seen a baby or a kid actually get distressed when, their parents gone or in the other room or whatever, it actually turns out that this system is one of the largest influential forces on a person's grief response. So that same separation distress that's occurring is also responsible for producing grief and loss within people. It's not the only variable that impacts a person's grief or loss. This is just a central component. And so what's important to know is that grief isn't even unique to humans. We often think it is, but we know through scientific research that elephants grieve. We know that primates and gorillas experience the same separation distress that we do. So do dogs. Okay? And maybe the jury's still out there on cats because cats are in their own category. I'm just kidding. I welcome you if you're a cat lover too. I am a dog person, but we're welcome to cat and bunny people too. Okay? We love all animals. And so what you need to know is that our brains and our nervous systems drive the attachment system. So what does that mean? Well, it means that from an early age, we learn through patterned repetitive experiences. We go through life creating what John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, the parents of attachment theory, okay, pun intended, on parents. Nobody ever laughs at that joke, but I enjoy saying it anyways. Okay. Anyways, what they found was that grief actually challenges people, what they call their internal working models. And internal working models means that we go through life having these pattern repetitive experiences. And so we unconsciously create these ideas about ourselves, these notions about other people, about how and what reality truly is. My mentor, Dr. Darcy Harris, called this the assumptive world, which was based off of John Bowlby's work. And what this means is that we, in a very simple way, we take our lived experience with us in everything we do, and we can't disconnect from it. And you can tell when this is violated, excuse me, because people will say after they've experienced a significant loss, I don't get this. I can't wrap my mind around this. This doesn't make any sense to me. And what you hear right there already is the violation of the internal working model. Like, I've had all these life experiences and this has happened and this isn't lining up. And then they might say something to you like, I thought bad things aren't supposed to happen to good people. And again, you hear the violation of an assumption, of a belief about reality, right? Just from their past experiences. And so this is what it means to have a internal working model. And also it's important to know that we all have attachment styles, which is that our relationships with our primary caregivers offer us basically a relational blueprint. And it comes up later in life. And maybe we can go to the next slide. Okay. So one of the nice things about attachment theory is that by actually looking at and understanding how somebody engaged with their primary caregivers, we can actually understand years later why all sorts of people have different responses to loss. This is why some people need to pull away from loss. Maybe it's really hard for them to go into their grief. Other people need to be surrounded by people. They need to know people's around. Another person might be a puddle of emotions and overwhelmed and, just totally preoccupied with the loss. So this is just a great framework for understanding that people have all sorts of different reactions to loss and grief. And the fact that the past does live on in the present. Okay? Attachment theory is also very optimistic. So if you had a less than ideal childhood, Okay, and you're hearing this stuff and you're like, oh shit, like I just experienced a significant loss. You're telling me I maybe have to think and talk about my childhood. Like, are you serious right now? Um, the good news that I want you to know is that within you, this attachment system is hardwired for connection. So even if you didn't get that consistent, loving, supportive care that we hope all kids get, there is something within you that is open to that. And we'll talk about a little bit about why it can also be difficult to access that when we start talking about trauma. But it's really important that people know that whatever happened in childhood isn't a life or death sentence. It's just one of the most influential factors that comes up around grief and loss. And I just don't think we often talk about that enough. So, what significant loss does really is that it kind of shatters our internal working model. But when grief is actually expressed and honored, grief actually starts gluing back the pieces together. No, we're never the same, as Jodi was saying. We're just not. We're never the same. But grief is painful. I would never wish it on anyone, but it is medicinal. Why is it medicinal? Because grief very simply means relearning the world. Grief means that we're honoring this terrible loss that we've experienced, and we're honoring the separation, the stress that we are experiencing in whatever way, just intuitively and naturally and organically makes sense for us. And so grief itself is a very active process. It's very dynamic. It's not static. It's not like a linear sort of model here. It ebbs and flows. And grief is all, at the end of the day, about adjustment. And adjustment is painful. Okay, this is distressing. It's heartbreaking. Like I said, I wouldn't wish it on anyone, but grief is not the enemy. Grief is the price we pay for love, loss, and connection. Okay, next slide. Okay, so let's just really quickly talk about, well, so if this is bereavement, loss, grief, then what's trauma? Well, trauma is when our brain, nervous system, and attachment system initiates responses towards threat and towards survival, but we become totally overwhelmed and immobilized. So something happens that makes people get stuck in their responses. So when grief is actually fully expressed, it's never a romantic process. It's one of the most heartbreaking processes a person can go through. But grief will get you where you need to go. What trauma does very simply is trauma equals disconnection. Okay. And so we know trauma is present and not just a everyday sort of loss that's painful and hard to adjust to, but trauma is present when people become psychologically rigid, when there is a sense of freeze or collapse, when people feel like they're stuck in a self-defeating pattern and they, no matter what they can do, they can't get away from it. And so a metaphor like this picture shows that trauma is kind of like a vortex, okay? And this vortex can take you maybe two ways. We can think about more classical trauma where a person after a traumatic event has to back up against the wall. They're really hyper vigilant. It feels like they're in the vortex, so they're just constantly swirling around. There's a lot of hyper arousal. We can go high. We can feel angry and fearful. It has such an intense energy that just overwhelms us. And it's so intrusive and violating. And yet, trauma can also go another way, which is we can go into the vortex itself. So instead of being sucked around and so disoriented and lost in the trauma vortex, we get pulled in. And when we get pulled in, well, welcome to Dante's Inferno. We're in the realm of disassociation. We're in the realm of numbness, of depression, collapse, and going down. So people can go up, they can go down, people can even have a combination. I mean, trauma is a living hell, like an absolute living hell. But what people need to know is that the symptoms can actually be treated. Okay. And so what gets confusing then is that people want to start taking like, okay, so we can actually tend to these survival responses. And yes, we can tend to also grief, but don't think for a second, don't get into a fix-it mentality when it comes to loss because it just doesn't work. Like you can never, unless you're a necromancer and you can resurrect the dead, like butt out. Like just butt out. Like it's so unrealistic, right? That's grief is not a cognitive distortion or any type of psychopathology. It's the most natural response to loss. And survival responses are hellish and brutal, and they keep us small and stuck and immobilized. Okay. The good news is that we can actually tend to some of these things. So I think that's a pretty good summary on grief and trauma. Jodi, what do you want to add?
That was amazing. And
Thank you.
that, Mark and I in developing this whole um presentation, it's interesting because with my own trauma language, I really struggle with word associations and the way in which, English language does not do grief justice. And like Mark, I'm authentic to who I am, so I just have to say it. We were really struggling. I was really struggling with the word adaptive, right? Because I really feel like there's like people think about adaptation or process and sort of have these thoughts that are already associated with it. And what I heard you say today, that was like super validating and like awesome, was not even using that word, switching it to like that relearning. Grief is about relearning, and you and I always would also argue unlearning, right? It's unlearning that everything that we've been told or that have gotten us through really hard things before, that sort of way we've made sense of the world may have been true in those moments, but aren't necessarily true for us now. And it sort of gives a different sort of maybe power or responsibility, versus like making it about a person needing to change, rather a collective experience and vortex that's constantly shifting.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that, Jodi. And I just also want to add, Jodi, we've got about 15 minutes before we're going to go to questions. So maybe we'll just pick this up just for folks, okay?
Okay, yeah, gotcha. Okay, I know we get us talking. Okay, so Mark and I felt like it'd be really good after we kind of talked about our shared understanding of grief and trauma and bereavement, that we had a few examples that would sort of help people as we move into some of those points of like how a trauma informed practice could look, that you had some ideas to bounce it off of. So when we go back and we look at the COVID pandemic, the reason we're using this example is talking about how um, all grief, uh, all trauma has grief, but not all grief has trauma. And COVID-19 would be a great example of a very collective experience of grief. There was lots of time where people couldn't spend time with the people they loved, maybe didn't have access to their coping skills, like weren't able to go to the gym. Even things like grocery shopping, you couldn't feel like you were doing grocery shopping right without some sort of judgment. So there was grief for many of us, although some of us may have experienced sort of more traumatic losses of when people were taken away for an illness in an ambulance and never being able to see your person again. Um, the idea of um, not being able to caregive and have those last moments, um, the the importance of, someone brought up spirituality, ceremony, right? Being able to celebrate a person's life or mourn and grieve their death collectively was not able to happen. And so some of us experienced more a more traumatic loss during that time. And I think, I'm not sure people would remember, there was a saying that went out that said something like, we're all in the same boat. I don't know why people are like this. And then someone wrote, we're actually not all in the same boat. We're maybe all in the same storm, but we're all on different boats. And we need to kind of remember that each person's experience are personal. Another sort of experience to look at loss when we're looking at like the idea of death losses and non-death losses, the idea of what living in a less than ideal home growing up would be like, to sort of the other end of like a very violent home, and where children may have lost sort of a sense of trust, or as they grow up, maybe feel lost towards childhood, having to grow up too soon, not being able to trust the adults that they were supposed to be able to attach and seek safety from, but maybe also the outer community who also, and the social context of maybe systems don't help, and or maybe they do, but with a cost, all these different sort of ideas. I'm moving through this a little faster than I normally would have because of time. The last example for this slide is the idea of murder and suicide. I chose to bring up an Indigenous photo of missing and murdered children, because there's also a cultural component that goes along. There's definitely some sort of disenfranchised grief, meaning people aren't recognized having the grief that they hold. There's what we call an ambiguous loss that often happens when there's been a violent murder or suicide, where there's Mark sort of speaks to that closure idea, where ambiguous loss comes in is more around certainty. When there's things that we cannot be certain about, that can create a more traumatic experience for us in when we don't have all the answers of what happened or why it happened. And then we're also, when things happen more tragically, there is a bigger social eye on it and lots more opinions. And with the social containers we live in now, we see what other people's our opinions are. We're feeling judged. Someone put in there around like, having people look in. I remember thinking about a fishbowl and being like, the fish inside, and everybody thinks they know what it's like to live in this fishbowl because they can see the fish, but they actually don't know what it's like to breathe underwater. So it's sort of that idea that when these things happen, we invite way more systems in, which have an potentially can make it more complex and have more traumatic experience. So like if you're a person of color, and the way in which the legal system deals with it, can also sort of have complicated implications that may in fact engage that survival response differently, and being able to ask for help outside of and being able to grieve. And then Mark and I discussed me sharing my personal story and figuring out, where I start, what's comfortable for me, and some of the things I experienced. I would argue most people who lose a child, you're probably managing traumatic loss with them. Our whole lives we're taught that we can protect our children, and there's very few of us that know that we can't, and that's very scary for the rest of the world to live in. So the rest of the world can't go there with us, and so we live very uniquely, and it can, and so you have the grief of your person, so that very tangible loss, and then you have the grief of, well, for me, when my husband and I divided and conquered, I was the one that took Georgia to skating. I was the one that took, so my daily life actually changed. And those social circles that I hung out with once a week changed because I didn't go to those places. And not saying those people didn't want to be there or support me. It's they had to keep going, and what was I going to go for? We had some issues with the medical system, and maybe not people making mistakes, but people like in early on in their learning and not knowing things, and having an understanding and an empathy for that. But can I trust doctors? Can I trust the people when you're in one of like somewhere where people are supposed to be able to help and those types of things. So another loss for me was losing that. Um, there was the big world belief loss. Mark alluded to this earlier around those sort of things we tell ourselves, like what we put out in the world, we get back. Um, while that can't be true, I'm a social worker. I feel like I give a little. My husband's a police officer. My in-laws both work within the church, are minister and chaplain, and I'm like, this whole God thing, I'm like, they're pretty close to God, and it still happens. So, it's like that assumptive world came crashing in, and needing, when Mark speaks to that attachment idea of things, is you can't walk that alone when you feel so unsafe in the world, when you don't know who you can trust anymore, when everything you've grown up to get you through anything hard, like losing a job, losing a friendship, no longer makes sense. And so there was like these, physical, not feeling physically safe, not feeling emotionally safe for people who lose partners. There's also financial components of being off work. Like there's so much complexity that can go into it. So just sort of inviting these other ideas of like we lose all these very tangible things, and then we lose these very intangible things and have to sort of remake meaning as we go forward, and that can be very, very difficult to do alone. And as Mark said, trauma closes your world. um, and disconnection, and we actually would argue we need connection to heal. Yet how do we find that connection when our experience has been very unsafe?
Yes, that's so well said, Jody, and that's why we wanted to mention attachment science here. Not only is this a template for understanding grief and trauma, but it also reinforces our framework, which we want you to leave with today, which is that it is through the eyes of another in which we come to understand ourselves. Very simply. Okay. And so with this presentation today, we're just going to invite you to consider, what's your role in the collective and trauma healing of our times? Because first of all, we just need people who are comfortable enough to say, you know what? I know my buddy Mark's a grief therapist. You know what? Let me connect you with him. You've got some really complicated stuff. Okay. And we just need people who can just have these conversations, are open to them, and can get people to where they need to go. We also need people in all domains, teachers, journalists, not-for-profit workers, funeral directors, allied healthcare staff who can actually be support people and actually step into this idea of what we would call a secure attachment. And a secure attachment is really somebody who's psychologically available, who's there for you, can listen, take care, okay, and not try to approach this from a place of cure or let's like grief is not the enemy here, like what we're saying, right? So actually being a person who can orient to a compassionate state, a state of presence, okay. uh Jody, I just mentioned a couple points on the PowerPoint. What would you like to highlight?
Absolutely. Where you started with, I even invite like HR and health and safety reps and friends. Like it's the presence, and we know that all people benefit from any grief support. All people benefit from listening and presence. We know some people may need more specialized care, whether that is with peers who've experienced similar things, or whether it moves into more of a professional practice, like seeing a therapist, and then a therapist who sort of maybe understands grief and trauma at those different levels. Um, but there's a role for this in everything we do, and understanding when we explain that grief is just not a moment in time. It's something that rehappens over and over again. So when we're going to our jobs and we're going to schools, that we have that idea of, okay, like this might be a tough moment, and what can I do to support that moment authentically? So we're not asking you to step outside who you are as a person, to share your own personal beliefs and values of how you believe the world, but we do want you to be authentic, to be able to understand that and compassionately walk with someone that what their truth is really as bad as it is, and that you can be a person, or that you will find someone for them to walk with. Um, and
Hmm.
always being sort of culturally humble as well, because there are very different rituals that um, go along. So I can remember once saying at a meeting that a very well-known meeting where I was with death, dying, and grief professionals, experts, and I used the word "my daughter passed," and I was scolded that we do not use the word "past" in this environment. We use death or dying, and um, someone I actually believe people transition. Um, uh, so I don't even often use the word dying. I think energy transitions to spirit. That's my own belief. And so for someone to tell me what, even in our profession, to tell me I need to use death and dying, no, like we just need to be present in how other people need us to be present, even if that's not who we are.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that's really well said, Jody. And this is it. You need to approach grief and trauma slowly, and people hate that because we live in a world that tells us go fast, go make money, be productive. You know, everything's about functionality, and you just have to remove that mindset when approaching these sacred and distressing human experiences. Tioni, maybe we can go to the next slide. Oh, sorry, one more back. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you, thank you. That's great. So we got a beautiful picture of Jody there, and also a picture I created of my dog who tragically died this year. And it's such a it was so therapeutic though to create this. You know, like creativity is, I believe, is something that flows through us. It's not something we own. And just like grief, it something deeper needs to find expression through us. And so metaphor, symbol, art, creative expressions, non-literal approaches are often highly beneficial, right? And yes, we also hold this tension with like, you know, it's very helpful to have knowledge of attachment science and neurobiology and all the rest of it. But like, that's not what grieving people need to hear. Okay. That's not what grieving people need to experience. They need to experience somebody who can hold this in a sacred container, in an environment that connects and supports and helps facilitate grief, with the right people and with the right connection to themselves. And one of the things I teach a lot of people in my practice is to start developing your own Goldilocks radar. And what I mean by a Goldilocks radar is we want that just right amount of porridge. So sometimes we have to go a little bit hotter, and it's as Jody was talking about, we're going to need a little bit of that bravery, some of that courageous vulnerability, and sometimes we need to go a little bit colder. Okay, there's no one size fits all approach with grief. People are at different places. So what is the just right amount of grief, or before somebody maybe needs to take a break, or maybe for them to actually take the step to go towards the loss? Okay. Uh, so everybody has their own Goldilocks or different level of distress, and we don't want to take people too hot or too cold. We want to keep them just right, and then maybe help support them if they need a little bit help towards the loss, or if they need a little bit help sometimes to also take a break from the loss as well. Jody, what would you like to briefly mention about this slide before we go to questions?
I would just add that the continuing bonds idea too, like so when we're specific to like death loss, that it's important to remember for people that it's not talking about their losses that make them upset, it's the actual loss that makes them upset. And people's bodies die, but love doesn't. And what are ways that we carry it forward? And that's sort of through these metaphors and rituals and making meaning and purpose, not just in our own lives, but I will never say like trauma has to make purpose, like trauma didn't make us this way. And I think it's very important that we understand trauma didn't, but we continue the love that we have despite physical absence, and how do you bring that forward? Um, and sometimes having us or a friend as a transitional sort of secure attachment in in the short term, so as people feel safe with the world, because when they find their people, what I've recognized in practice is people don't always have the people they want in their corner, but they always have people in their corner. It's finding them.
Yeah, that's a great point. And so just as we wrap up, we would welcome some quick questions, and then we'll hand it over to Tioni and the admin to talk a little bit about the grief education program. Just as you're typing up your questions, one thing I want to say is that we are in discussion with Tioni and Trish about the development of a course specifically for trauma and grief. So nothing's been officially decided here, and we're just having this conversation because our program currently masterfully, very skillfully goes so deep into grief and loss. And we talk a little bit about trauma, but not like even this presentation today. This is the tip of the iceberg. And we have so much more to share. And we also know that people are also working in a lot of settings, and they also have a lot to contribute to discussions around grief and trauma. So we're looking at the development of a course. So I would just say, anybody who's interested, if you wanted to bombard the Zoom chat right now and just express your interest, like just I give yourself permission to just share your enthusiasm right towards Tioni. Let her know that you're interested in Jodi and I co-facilitating a course together around trauma-informed grief support. We'd love to hear what you have to say.
So, I do see a question in there. I don't want to get lost with the enthusiasm of the new course, of a potential new course. Um, this is a great question around sort of another sort of ambiguous loss around life-limiting illness, and maybe even like life-limiting, meaning like not being able to live to full capacity, whether it be a death loss or someone who's like losing part of who they are, um, and experience anticipatory grief. So, do you have any specific advice for supporting people experiencing anticipatory grief? We're going to go back to sort of, for me, the basic. It's feel it, because that's what's happening. Is yes, there's a piece of you that needs to live in the now and love what you have now, and you also have to honor that you're aware that things are going to change, and acknowledging that, so that there's not a shame in it, because again, similar to trauma, shame, for me, in my experience, like in professional and personal, shame um, creates disconnection, right? So when people feel bad about feeling the way they're feeling, then they're making their world smaller again. So allowing them to feel all the things they need to feel, even if they want to enjoy the person while they're still living or have certain abilities. And Mark may want to add a little bit more.
Yeah, and to feel it in the right environment with the right people, with the right resources. And if you're saying, well, that's a lovely idea, but I don't know what that looks like, then maybe you need to send us an email and we'll talk to you more about that after this presentation. Maybe you don't have the right resources, and maybe you would benefit from actually collaborating and talking with us. So the door is open to also just reach out directly to us. Okay? What's the next question we have here?
We've got quite a few here. Can
Yeah.
you talk more about the Goldilocks approach to helping people through grief conversations? What are signs tangibly that a person is ready to go towards the grief? And we are coming up on the hour, so if anyone is able to stay, that would be great. Maybe we can just record a response to the questions, and then they can be included in the replay if folks have to end up leaving. You think? Yeah? Okay.
Sure.
Okay, so because I've got a couple of questions here. So let me know if you want me to repeat that first one.
Well, I mean, the Goldilocks way of doing things is Mark's, but my 2 cents on that would be is allowing people their own autonomy to recognize and go back to what does it feel like when we're talking about this? Like having them sense what's going on for them in their body. Is this moving too fast or is this moving, do you need it to move faster? Is it like allowing some autonomy? I'm not sure that we get to make the decision whether people are ready to sort of go forward in their grief. We wonder, we wonder with them.
Yes, yes, and to skillfully companion them. So, like it's really helpful, for example, if we were to offer a course about this, like we would talk a lot about attachment styles to actually help people identify, is this a person? Because there's a whole list of traits that we can't go into today about people who are typically more avoidant, people who are more anxious or preoccupied with their grief, versus people who are what's called disorganized attachment, who chaotically employ avoidance and attachment. And there are very concrete, tangible things to look for. One quick website and resource would be traumasolutions.com by Diane Poole Heller. She's got some great stuff on attachment theory, but she also looking at that as just the tip of the iceberg again. So definitely like attachment theory can help give you a really concrete radar for understanding where is this person at? Um, how can I leave an invitation, in other words, to what Jodi was saying? How can I respect their self-agency where they're at? And yet maybe also help them lean in a little bit more to the discomfort, or if they're feeling suffocated by their grief, to also maybe take a break as well. Okay. So hopefully that gives you some starting points. Tioni, maybe we can do one more question and then we'll go to your information.
Okay, this was a question seeking to clarify. I always thought some experiences were inherently traumatic, but you seem to be saying that trauma is a response to loss, but not a necessary response. Am I understanding correctly?
So yeah, so trauma is also in the eye of the beholder. So two people can go into a car accident. One person can be totally fine and one person's not. And so why is that? Well, there's a million and one different variables we could talk about. We talked about early childhood experiences being one of those influential variables, but different people have different bodies and different people have different thresholds for distress and also different types of distress, right? Like I am very sensitive to distress that is more existential and meaning making in nature. Like that just weighs on me so much more than say physical distress. Like maybe I just have a high pain tolerance. So there's all sorts of variables that go into what is traumatic or not for a person. We gave you some concrete things to look for. But it's just important to not assume that something is intrinsically traumatic, because there's just a lot of hard stuff that people go through in life, and it doesn't mean necessarily that they need to talk to a therapist or that they need to, do something like the. It's different for everybody, and so. I would just encourage you to go back on that slide where we're talking about trauma and look if there's a theme of fragmentation, of disconnection, of overwhelm, collapse, psychological rigidity, hyperarousal, hypoarousal. And if we offer this course, well, I mean, talk so much more about this too. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Mark. There are a couple more questions, but maybe I'll connect with you two afterward and see if we can include something in the follow-up email that can help
Okay.
people with that.
Mhm.
Thank you everyone for sticking around with us. Thank you, Jodi and Mark. Amazing presentation as always. I saw a couple of questions about this in the chat, so I just want to share. As you have heard, Mark and Jodi are two of the facilitators that are part of our wonderful grief education program. It's a 3-course program, 6-week courses fully online. They're delivered mainly asynchronously, but an opportunity to connect synchronously within each course as it fits. And the curricula was developed in consultation with grief and bereavement researchers, practitioners, educators, just like Jodi and Mark. You'll see a QR code on the screen that you can scan to learn more about the program. And if you're interested and want to learn more from Mark, his passion and his knowledge, he is the facilitator of the first course of the program, the Introduction to Grief and Bereavement. The next session will be starting January 16th and will run to February 27th. Jodi's got course 2. Oh, I'm sorry, Jodi's got course 3, which will happen in the spring, and Dr. Karima Joy, who's also part of this awesome team, does course 2 in March, but you'll learn all about that on the website. So feel free to take a look or send us an email. As I mentioned, we'll be sending a follow-up with the replay link and some of the resources, and any of the questions we may have missed, we'll do our best to try to answer those for you. And just for anyone who hasn't had a chance, if you could please share your feedback with us, we'd love to know more about how you enjoyed this webinar. We also have some questions about what else you'd like to see. So it's really important if you can share that information with us. We just want to know how else we can support this community. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us and sharing your lunch hour. Jodi, Mark, as always, a pleasure. And have a great rest of your day, guys. Thank you.